How did it feel having to swallow that change?
Well, look, these are really difficult policy and political challenges for us, and I think in every policy proposition I've been part of considering, right back to Tampa, in ALP forums and in government, there is no proposition that has completely satisfied me. All of them challenge my own personal ethics, and I think that is the view of politicians on all sides of politics who've had to come to grips with this. But if I can respond to the question about the ethical framing of this question of asylum seekers. I mean, we had a far less than admirable start to this question in the pre-war period, when Roosevelt brought us all to San Francisco in '38 and proposed that the Jews be brought out of Europe and put into places like America and Australia. Ours was not a good position on this, and I think Australia in the post-war period took a view across the country and across politics that we had an obligation to take in a substantial number of people seeking asylum, and we've done that ever since. There is substantial debate, though, about how we do that and how we treat people, to use Prue's terms, in camps seeking entry to Australia through the UNHCR, the United Nations, versus people who get on a boat. Now, for the first time, I think the report that we received today and endorsed in principle in Cabinet and in caucus today sets as a central proposition an ethical framework that says there should be no advantage given to a person arriving by boat or other irregular means against a person arriving in Australia via a camp in Africa, a camp on the Thai-Burma border, or in Malaysia. That is boldly stated the first time I've seen such a clear ethical framework given to our policy. Now, it's one I happen to agree with in principle, but I think it's also incredibly important in deterring people from seeing advantage by getting on a boat in Indonesia and taking a very risky and too often fatal boat journey to Christmas Island. So that is the central decision we took in principle. It includes a significant uptake in the number of asylum seekers we'll take every year to 20,000, which will take us from number 3 to number 2 in the world in absolute numbers. And in pro rata terms, it'll take us to the number 1 recipient country of asylum seekers in the world. I mean, I think those two ethical propositions are very, very sound.
Philip Blond, watching this debate, are you surprised at how much it has gripped the Australian public with relatively few asylum seekers in question?
Yeah, it is interesting, and I'd like to know why. But I do think...
Have you thought about this? I mean, you're advising Tony Abbott on potential policy changes. What about taking this one back to Britain and saying, well, these guys have come up with an ethical framework to solve the whole thing?
Well, I think in some sense, John Howard... Well, I think in some sense, and what's interesting is I think everybody who's spoken on this has actually said very lucid things that I'm not in any disagreement with. But I think the fundamental policy in terms of this sort of migration is it's actually financed through criminal activity. And often what's found globally is the people who are doing it are the rich ones. They pay people to take them over. And it's imperative to actually stop the financial incentives. And actually, if you had, I mean, you know, Howard's policy was viewed as harsh, but in fact, you need to be harsh on the illegal side and generous in the way you spoke on the legal side, because that will stop people risking their lives, paying money that perhaps stretches across large kith and kin networks to come over and risk their lives. And I think if you actually remove the financial incentives through being hard on asylum, you can be more generous to asylum.
OK, well, I briefly on this want to go to Cassandra Goldie, and what's effectively happened here is that the notion put about years ago that the asylum seekers reaching our shore effectively were queue jumpers has now been written into policy.
There's a lot of concern amongst members of ACOS today about the findings from the expert panel. The social services people have been working for a long time with families and individuals who've come in a whole range of circumstances from many parts of the world where there is serious conflict, and I can assure you, in the same way as you say, Mark, there was a very sombre effort to come to a clear view on where to draw the line in the sand about what we are prepared to do in order to try and stop people from losing their lives on the ocean. But the very clear view is that not any means justifies the ends. And what we are, again, talking about today is that when people make it to our shore, that we will use poor treatment of them, taking them to a third location, potentially having them locked up for extended periods of time, because this principle of no disadvantage mark means we don't know exactly how long people will be in detention in Nauru or Manus Island. We know so well that long-term detention means chronic mental health problems. It is inhumane treatment of people, most of whom are refugees who will desperately do anything to try and get somewhere safe. The best deterrent, the tragic deterrent, is already people know that they are risking their lives to come this way.
So to have a policy that encourages
what we need to our view of it is
you can't explain the increase. And if you accept people, what you actually do is you actually ensure more people will get on the boats, and that is more dangerous for more people. I totally take your point. I wouldn't want to defend the type of detention that actually makes people mentally ill. But the point is it's imperative morally to stop them getting on the boat in the first place. Remove the criminal incentives, and that will save lives.
Let's hear from the government minister, because
criminal conduct in Indonesia on
you have come to this
conclusion.
conclusion.
Treat people poorly when they get here.
I agree.
Sorry, excuse me. I'm sorry, Mark Butler. You're
sorry, you're the boss.
We're nearly out of time. I want to bring you as a government, as a Labor government. You've not only come to this decision late, very late. You've actually reversed your previous position. Are you comfortable with that?
Well, look, I don't think I am entirely comfortable with anything that we've had to come to grips with in this area. Politically, in policy terms, most importantly in human and personal terms, this is a diabolically difficult area, and I don't think there's a silver bullet which people could say, oh, we haven't thought of this, how about this? You'll all sleep comfortably at night having done this. This is just too difficult. And what we've seen over the 12 or so years we've really been trying to come to grips with this issue is the goalpost shifts. I mean, the High Court decision changed the capacity for us to do things we wanted to do as a government, but more importantly what's happened is the people smugglers have just changed the way in which they do business. And so, yes, things that frankly were no-go zones in 2001 when I first went to national conferences debating this are now policy propositions that we accept are essentially inevitable if we're actually going to get control back over the way in which people are coming to Australia.
And what you're already hearing from Tony and others.
And avoid the loss of life that we've seen over the last couple of years, that we saw 6 weeks ago when 100 people lost their life during the debate we had 6 weeks ago. We've heard reports now that there's another boat that is suspected to have been lost with 60 people on board that is the subject of investigation. And time we hear that there are most probably a range of boats that never come to our attention, that never got from Indonesia to Christmas Island.
Okay.
So all of these things bear very heavily down on all of us.
I'm sorry to do this to you, we're running short of time. I want to come back to Peter Singer, and just listening to the debate, as you've heard, and the very different positions, can you come to a kind of ethical conclusion as to who's done the right thing here?
I think I can, because I am, as Philip said, a utilitarian. He linked that with fascism in a classic smear, but it has nothing to do with it, of course. But as a utilitarian, I'm concerned about numbers. And one of the most important things in this report, and which the government has said is accepted, is the increase in the number of refugees we take from around 13,000 now to 20,000, with looking at, over the next 5 years, going to 27,000. So that means an extra 7 or maybe an extra 14,000 people who are currently in very tough situations, who are going to have the opportunity to have a new life in Australia. And that's what I really welcome. And I think that outweighs, for me anyway, outweighs the fact that there is going to be a hardship for some people who are going to be processed offshore and are not going to get into Australia when they otherwise might have. But, you know, I think you have to be guided by the numbers here. Plus, of course, the factor, as has been mentioned, that we do want to discourage people from getting onto boats that are unsafe.
No, I'm sorry, panellists, but that is all we have time for. Please thank our panel: Mark Butler, Philip Blond, Cassandra Goldie, Peter Singer and Prue Goward. And our apologies to our Quanda community, no doubt madly tweeting away, wondering why they're not on the screen. I'm sure we'll have the tweets back on the screen by next week. Now, joining the panel then will be outspoken Labor Senator Doug Cameron, rising Liberal star Simon Birmingham, Labor insider turned commentator Graham Richardson, the Australian's political columnist Janet Albrechtson, and author, comedian and mother of 5, Mandy Nolan. Until next week's Q&A, good night.